The Australian government has made one action in that general direction, which is to suspend a small military training and exchange program that it had with the Tatmadaw, which is the name of the armed forces in Myanmar. But that's about it. And both other countries here, the Labor opposition, but also a range of NGOs and human rights groups have been urging the Morrison government to impose more, to try to attack the sources of revenue of the Tatmadaw, which, apart from being an armed force, is an enormous business enterprise. It's the biggest business enterprise in Myanmar. And to use the new Magnitsky sanctions framework, which was passed through the parliament just a couple of months ago, which allows the targeting of individuals, named individuals, generals or others in this case, whose assets could be frozen, bank accounts shut in Australia. Because at the moment they have free range to invest, travel, real estate investments, bank accounts, whatever they want. The reason the government has given for not wanting to go harder has been that the Australian citizen and former economic advisor to Aung San Suu Kyi, Sean Turnell, is being held in detention still after a year in Myanmar. And therefore, we don't want to do anything too strident lest it impair his chances of liberty. But I think you'd have to say that after a year, without any successful progress whatsoever in this case, that's failed. It's also, I should point out there, a standard line from Australia's Department of Foreign Affairs and Trade for why they go soft on any country where an Australian citizen is held. The evidence, in my view, over the years does not support that argument. Governments don't respond in general to nice gestures and soft talk. They do respond to pressure, especially governments like this.
And it leaves the junta unaccountable and essentially does not offer any real support for the people of Myanmar.
That's right. Usually the best approach is simply to use every available tool of pressure, every network of influence that can be brought to bear, financial, trade, economic, official to official, institution to institution relationships around the world. Australia has some. It doesn't have a huge suite, but the combined global linkages would be more effective and more powerful if our Chinese friends, who are the main economic and trading partner of Myanmar, were to take a tougher line. They have not. So there's very limited scope for bringing pressure to bear. And remember that, according to the World Bank, since this coup was staged a year ago, the Myanmar economy is 30% smaller than it would otherwise have been. So the generals are prepared to wear all of that, and that would cut into their own share of the economic pie as well, and not relent, not to mention the skirmishes and firefights going on around the fringes of the country with the various armed ethnic militias. So the Tatmadaw has really dug in on this, and in the face of that sort of intransigence, it really does take force majeure to have any real effect.
Yeah. Talking of China, what have you made of these sort of tentative attempts from Beijing to thaw relations with the Australian government? Well,
the two things have happened. The new ambassador has turned up in Canberra just in the last week, Ambassador Zhao. And the other thing is he's issued a statement which has, as you say, generally been interpreted in Australia as being a relatively benign one. And most headlines have even described it as an olive branch offering to Australia. I think, though, this is simply because, in contrast to his predecessor, he's not actually delivered any threats, because his predecessor regularly delivered threats. His predecessor was the one who delivered the 14 demands on Australian sovereignty in return for resumption of normal trade and political relations. So the new guy has not done any of those things, and he's said fairly standard things about wanting to improve cooperation and communication, wanting to, quote, push the China-Australia relationship back on track. Now, of course, the avenues for doing that are very straightforward, and the federal government has said, well, if you start withdrawing the 14 demands that you've made on our sovereignty, then we might have something to talk about. There's no indication that the new ambassador is offering anything substantive like that. The second thing that's happened, just briefly, is that the chargé d'affaires at the Chinese embassy before the new ambassador's arrival, Deputy Ambassador Wang, offered to Australia the concept in a newspaper editorial of joint work to secure the Pacific Islands, to work together on Pacific Island security relations. And that's been pretty much laughed off by officialdom in Canberra, just quietly, who see it simply as a Trojan horse to try to increase Chinese influence and control in the South Pacific.
Good to talk, Pete. Thanks so much.
Pleasure, Beth.